Dusty, thank you for being here. I'm wondering if, as we start off, if we could just hear from you your conversion story, how you found the church, a little bit about your background and what brought you to this point in your life.
Well, I was raised by my mom and a lot by my grandparents. My mother was Lutheran, my grandfather was Catholic, my grandmother was Baptist. So I attended all three churches growing up. Mostly the Lutheran church. Considered being a minister at one point. Stopped going to church when a tragedy happened to a family friend when I was in college. I graduated from college in 1982. My mother had been to Salt Lake on business, and someone had given her a Book of Mormon, and she had placed it on the bookshelf in my old bedroom. And I'd gone home to visit my mom, or as I, to be honest, like I tell people, washing clothes was free. And while I was washing clothes, I thought I would read a Louis L'Amour Western in my bedroom, old bedroom. So I was looking through the books, and the Book of Mormon literally fell off my bookshelf. And I sat down and began to read it, had opened it up just randomly, and it was on 3rd Nephi, and that interested me. And so I got the phone book out and looked up, didn't know what number to call because I don't, ward or stake. I didn't know which number to call, but like I tell people, I was hungry. It was lunchtime, so I called the stake. And a fellow answered the phone, happened to be the stake president. He said that he was never there during the week, but he had forgotten something on Sunday and had popped by during lunch to pick it up. And we chatted, and he arranged for me to meet with the missionaries at the University Ward in Austin, Texas. Met with the missionaries, and within a few weeks was baptized. I was a college graduate at the time, but I was baptized.
Okay, so you found this faith through a reading of the Book of Mormon. So what happened next? Did your testimony increase?
I was a college graduate. I was 23. Started attending the university ward at University of Texas, where all the single adults were, college age, my age, a little younger than me. And it was funny that people started to come up to me and saying, "You should serve a mission," and I was totally against serving a mission. I was 23. I had a job. I was a college graduate. I wasn't a kid, and I would tell people I'm not going to ever do that. I'm not going to be a missionary. I have a job, a degree. Not going to do that. But I ended up serving a mission. I was actually sitting in Sacrament one day, and literally felt this incredible impression that I needed to quit what I was doing and serve a mission. And I sold everything that hadn't been saving up for a mission, so I had to sell everything that I had and go serve a mission. When I was at the MTC, I didn't have a lot of family support, a lot of friend support, because a lot of people did not appreciate the fact that I even became a member of the church. But then to quit a job where I was making money and go and serve a mission where there was not going to be a salary made, they thought I was insane. And I felt at times like I was babysitting. I was 24. Most of the kids there were 19. They had never been away from home. I had. And I felt very out of place sometimes. And one day I thought, if nobody cares if I'm here, I'm going home, because this is not for me. And I went to the payphone and called church headquarters. And I got a lady on the phone, and I just said, if nobody cares if I'm here, I'm going home. And she said, "Will you hold a second?" So I held for a second, and this voice comes on the phone and says, "Elder, if nobody else cares if you serve a mission, I do. My name is L. Tom Perry."
Oh my.
And so we chatted, and then he asked me if I would be his pen pal on my mission. So I was his pen pal, or he was my pen pal on my mission. And when I came off my mission, he asked me to come up to Salt Lake to meet him in his office and give him a mission report. So I did. And it was after my mission that I went to law school. And in my third year of law school, I went to Palmyra and to see the pageant, and encountered anti-Mormons. I had never seen those before in my 6 years in the church. And I came back from that experience wanting to be smarter so I could debate them better. And I began to find things in my studies that I had never heard before in my 6 years in the church. And I thought, I didn't know this. No one's ever told me this. And when I asked questions in '89, I was told, don't ask questions, just have faith. Until I woke up one day and I realized that I no longer had my testimony. And I sent a letter to the stake saying, please take my name off church records. I got a letter back saying that I was excommunicated.
So how did that make you feel?
Angry, because I hadn't done anything wrong. All I had done was send a letter saying, I mean, they could have easily just said, oh, fine, we'll take your name off the records. No more. No, no harm, no foul. Done. No, they excommunicated. They had a hearing, excommunicated me. And that's what I think made me angry. And I also think that one of the things, you hear a lot, people can leave the church but can't leave it alone. You hear that quite a bit. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that if you become Catholic or Baptist or Lutheran or Methodist, and you leave that church, you haven't invested anything. There is no true investing of yourself to be a Baptist or a Lutheran. It's just you're there or you're not. But when you become a member of the church, it involves a complete change of life. If you smoke, you can't smoke. I never did, but if you drink, you can't drink, and I never did. But you can't, there's certain things that you have to change in your life. I quit my job and went on a mission. So you have so much invested that when you lose your testimony, you think you've been deceived. You gave up all that for what? And so I think there's a lot of resentment, and for me, a lot of anger. And so I became one of those people that I met in Palmyra. I became very anti, and I was a vocal anti. I would go to churches and give classes against the LDS Church. I would write articles. I would argue with people on the street, missionaries on the street. I'd stop them and argue with them. I mean, I was very, very vehemently against the church.
Okay, I can understand why.
Can I add something here? One of the most offensive things that I was told by members when I was anti, when they knew when they found out I had left the church, I must have committed sin. Sometimes you don't leave the church because of sin. And I think most of the time, I think it's a bad assumption for members to have. And I think it's an offensive assumption for members to have that it must be because you did something wrong. No, can't it just be because we lost our testimony? We found something in history. We found something that we didn't like and couldn't explain. And I think that when members immediately assume that you did something wrong, it minimizes our testimony that we did have and minimizes our feelings that we do have. And I think that leaders need to understand that as well, that if you want to ever minister to former members, the one thing you shouldn't assume is that they did something wrong is why they left the church.
Yeah, I know. I've been guilty of that myself. I've sometimes thought that about people and said that, and I can see now why that would be a bit offensive. So Dusty, what were some of those questions that came into your mind that drove this wedge between your faith and your testimony?
Oh, there were several. Oh my gosh. One was the various versions of the first vision. I'm an attorney, and I used to tell people, members, when I would argue with them, I would say, if I can put a witness on the stand with two different versions of a story, I can win my trial. you know, if you know, and Joseph had 9. Okay, so obviously he's telling lies because of all the versions. And as an attorney, a litigator, you love it when the person opposing you, the witness opposing you, has 2 versions of a story. The other thing was geography, archaeology. If I could walk the streets of Jerusalem, why can't I walk the streets of Zarahemla? You know, if they're historical. I mean, those are 2 of the big ones. The blacks in the priesthood.
How were you able to resolve some of those original questions that led you away from the church?
In 2009, I had gone down to the border, Mexican border, to do depositions, and I contracted the swine flu. And I came back and I was very, very ill. And no doctor would see me. I couldn't get seen at the VA where I'd get my treatment, my medical care at the VA as a veteran. And 2 elders knocked on my door, and my son led them up to my bedroom. I was on I call it my deathbed, because I thought I was going to die. I was really, really sick. And the swine flu killed hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And one of the missionaries looked at me and said, you know, you're sick. And I said, man, spirit's strong in that one. But I asked him to leave. And they said, they asked if they could give me a blessing. And I said, well, if that'll get you out of my house, fine, give me the blessing. And they gave me the blessing, and I was immediately healed. Immediately. The fever broke, sweating stopped. I was able to get out of bed for the first time in several days. And I walked him downstairs and asked him never to come back. And but that was the first beginnings of the pull to come back. But I shoved it back, ignored it. My wife got transferred to Louisiana for her job, and we thought, well, you know, we would meet in Shreveport once a month. We would have a plan that she would take that job and we would live apart until they had the same position open in Texas and she could do a lateral move, come back to Dallas. And so I called my friend Mike, who I'd met online, one of my debating partners. Originally we didn't like each other at all, but we became friends over time. In fact, Mike is one of the reasons why I'm here, because he began to put my name in the temple, and he did that every week for 20 years. I called Mike and I said, Mike, pray that, well, what happened was that Susan, even though she's taken her district up to number 4 in the company, they were going to close her district in January of 2015, and they were going to let her go. But then the next day, her vice president called and said, don't sign anything. There's a position open in Baltimore. We want you to move to Baltimore. But stay where you are. It's 2 weeks to vet this position. Any of the positions, it's like 2 weeks vetting. So I called Mike and I said, Mike, we really want Susan to stay in the company, and we have a plan about her moving back to Texas when the position opens up in Texas. Can you pray that she gets this job in Baltimore? And Mike said he would pray. And then I said, however, if the Lord really wants me back in the church, he'll send Susan to Utah.
You said that to him?
I said that to Mike. Now there were no openings in Utah, and I knew that. Not a single opening. I was just making a joke. But the very next day, the person in Utah retired. And the very next day, Susan's paperwork was transferred to Utah, and she was hired immediately with no vetting. So I called Mike and I said, I'm not going to believe this, Mike, but Susan's going to Utah. And he said, well, you know what you told God. I said, Mike, I was just kidding. And he said, God wasn't. So I hit my knees and I said, okay, Heavenly Father, I've had 26 years of questions. I've never had the questions answered. The apologetics that I've heard don't work. I need answers. And over the next several weeks, I'd wake up in the middle of the night with an answer that I had never heard before. For example, and again, these answers worked for me, okay? When the Lord talks to somebody, it's for them, not for everybody, okay? So my answers may not work for anybody else. But like the archaeology, geography aspect, In my dream, the Lord asks me and says, if you walk the streets of Jerusalem, does that make the Bible true? And I said, no. And he said, but if someone's excavating tomorrow and they uncover a sign that says, welcome to Zarahemla, population 450, what does that do to the Book of Mormon? And I said, it makes it unequivocally true. And he said, then where would your faith be? Why would you need faith at that point? And that makes perfect sense to me. We're not supposed to know, because if anything in the Book of Mormon is proven unequivocally true, then you don't have to have faith. And the whole purpose is to have faith. And that answer was never told to me before, but it works for me. That's just one example of the things that I woke up with in the middle of the night, these dreams that I was having. And then I woke up one day in March of 2015 and I had my testimony back. And I called Mike and I bore my testimony, and Mike wept.
Very good. Thank you. Would you go back to the Joseph Smith testimony part? That seemed to be a real stickler for you, something that really needed some explanation, perhaps.
Okay.
Or some better understanding. So how did you get through that?
Well, one of the apologetics that you always heard, and I never gave any credit to, was he told the story differently, as it were, with not really different aspects of the story based on to whom he was speaking and their need to know certain things, okay? And how that was brought to light to me wasn't really in a dream. Something had happened at work. And remember, Susan was at this point living in Utah. And I wanted to tell Susan about it. So when I started talking to her about it, I had taken out a lot of the beginning parts of that story because I didn't think they were critical for her, what I needed her to know, right? And Susan kept interrupting me and asking me questions. And I would have to stop her and go back, and I don't like to be interrupted. And I finally got angry at her and I said, I just want to tell you my story. And she said, well, if you tell me the full story, I wouldn't have to keep asking your questions and interrupting. And I leaned back in my chair, okay, nice one, God, I get it. But it dawned on me for the first time, okay, the apologetics actually do work on this one, because what I'm telling you today is true, but I'm not telling you everything that I do in my firesides. Right? I'm not telling you all the miracles that happened. I'm not telling you all the things that happened. I'm telling you little bits and pieces. Does that mean that all of a sudden my story's not true? Or I'm just not telling it the same way because of the medium that we're using today as opposed to when I'm giving a fireside? And it took a fight with my wife to bring that one out.
That's interesting. So just out of curiosity now, how far are you into your conversion when you were rooted out? Like, how many years were you in the faith before you left it?
6 years. I was baptized in May of 83, and I left the church in November of 89.
Okay. And you got home from your mission when?
My mission ended in January of 86.
Okay, so you were out of the church for several years, many years, 20 years. And prior to this blessing that you received from the elder, did you have other tugs and pulls that were having you come back feeling like, gee, I made a mistake about leaving?
Yeah. Like I said, after I was healed by the missionaries, I felt a pull. And that was 6 years before I came back. And even before that, every now and again, I feel a pull. But I never really, when I would think about it, I would never think it was really about the church. Even when in my most hated moments against the church, if you were to ask me, what was the best time of your life? I would have said, my mission. Okay? I loved my mission. And even when I hated the church, I still loved my mission. And I still read my missionary journal, and I still looked at the pictures of me being in Honduras and my mission. So when I was having the pull, I attributed it not to the pull to come back, but to fond memories of my mission. And I would tell people that of all the, because when I left the church, I mostly was non-denominational in the beginning, and then I went to the Baptist church when I left the Army. And when I was in the Army, I was more non-denominational churches on post. When I left the Army, I went to the Baptist church. It was the closest to my house. Then I became Catholic, and I was Catholic from 2002 until I left the church, and was rebaptized in 2015. So I loved being Catholic. But I would tell people that the most camaraderie I ever felt was as a member of the Latter-day Saints. Because in any other church you go to church, and you may go to Sunday school, and then you go home. And you don't have a lot of contact during the week with anybody. But you know, as a Latter-day Saints, you have home teaching and visiting teaching, and you have functions and activities, and people are always calling you. You can't, if I were to say, Bishop, I've got a leak in my basement, within an hour I'm going to have 50 people in my house trying to fix the leak. You don't see that anyplace else. And I would tell people that the most camaraderie I ever felt was as a Latter-day Saint. So yeah, you know, I had really good memories of the church, and I attributed the pull not to the pull to come back, but the fondness, the fond memories that I had of the church.
Okay, so you felt that you had great experiences and
oh yeah,
some good camaraderie.
Uh-huh.
When you left the church, Dusty, did you ever feel that maybe you should just go it alone? Hey, look, I believe in Jesus Christ. Let me just worship him in my own way, or were you looking for a church?
I always felt like look, I never felt comfortable in the Baptist church. Okay? My belief was always, and that's why I eventually became Catholic. My belief was, if there was no need for a restoration, then the Catholic Church is the true church. It was the initial church. It was Peter was the first pope, Matthew 16:18, you know, first pope. And if you believe that the church started back then, and there was no need for a restoration, that the Lord understood that there was mistakes made and sin done, blah blah blah, but he never left. You know, I will never leave you. Essentially, what he says in 16:18, and that whole section. Then there was no need for a restoration. Then the church you needed to be in was the Catholic Church, because it was the only one that maintained that line of authority, and priests can take the line of authority back to Peter. But if there was a need for a restoration, then the only church that you could really claim that would be the true church then would be the Latter-day Saints, because that's what they teach. If their story is true, then they're the true church. If their story is not true, then the Catholic Church is the true church. And I still believe that Protestants, there's a reason that it's from the word protest. You're basing your faith on a protest, and I don't think that God is a protest, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so thinking about coming back to this LDS faith and having left it in a huff, did you have any fear or concerns coming back?
None.
Explain.
Well, the thing with my wife moving here was truly a miracle. There were others that I talk about in the firesides. There were others, amazing things that happened that you just go, wow, you know.
I know there's a backstory about this missionary that gave you this blessing. Could you elaborate upon that a little bit for me?
Okay, so he gave me the blessing in 2009. In 2017, and that was in Dallas, Texas. In 2017, well, I'll back up a little further. In 2016, President Uchtdorf talked about me in General Conference. Okay, in the priesthood session, Alma and Amulek, that talked about Alma and Amulek. He didn't use my real name.
You had been rebaptized by then.
Sure. And I was living in Utah. But he told my story. But he didn't use my real name. And he said he wouldn't, and I was okay with that. So anyway, in February of 15, Susan and I go to a gun show in Sandy. I needed a holster because everything we owned was in storage because we went from a house in Dallas to an apartment in Salt Lake City. And I went to a table where they had holsters, and I'm talking to the fella, and he says, "You're from Texas." He could tell by my accent that I'm from Texas. I don't have an accent. Y'all do. But he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Let me tell you a story." He says, "Well, wait a second. So that talk in conference was about you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, can we chat?" And I said, "Sure." So Susan, my wife, and I, and this fella walk over to a quiet little area in the Sandy Expo Center, and another fella joins us. And I get done telling the story, and the fella that had joined us late said, "You're from Dallas?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "Oak Cliff?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "You don't remember me. But in 2009, 8 years ago, you had the swine flu, and I gave you a blessing." Now, what makes that even cooler is that after his mission, he goes inactive. And before the General Conference of 2016, October General Conference, his bishop gives him a ticket. He says, I'm done with your inactivity, here's a ticket. He goes to that priesthood session, hears the talk about Alma and Amulek, and it reactivates him, not realizing until several months later that the story was about a person that he'd given a blessing to in 2009.
So when you say ticket, you're speaking about a ticket to attend General Conference, right?
Yes.
So remind me of the timeline associated with this.
Okay, so I baptized in 83, leave the church in 89. In 2009, 20 years after that, I get the swine flu, and I get that blessing, and I don't come back to the church until 2015.
I get it. So you were still out of the church when you had this blessing, and you were still full of animosity towards the church.
Hated. Animosity is not strong enough. Hated the church. And in fact, like I said, even though they healed me immediately, I told them never to come back to my house. I walked them downstairs. No, I hated the church. Passionately hated the church.
Except 2 missionaries come in and give you a priesthood blessing in the name of the Lord, and you're healed. I mean, did you just think that was a coincidence?
Yeah, I started to feel a pull in 2009 after the healing, but I again attributed it to my good feelings about my mission and stuff, and I, for 6 years, kind of just ignored the feeling.
Okay, so you really had no embarrassment, no second guessing again about coming back to the church? No worries?
The reason there was no fear about coming back was because my testimony was back. Why would I be afraid? Okay, but when I left the church in 89, I was actually told by leadership in that stake that I had committed the unforgivable sin, that I could never come back because I had turned my back on the Spirit, the Holy Ghost. And that was the unforgivable sin, and I could never come back. So when I got healed in 2009, and this is kind of jumping over, kind of back and forth, but in 2009 when I got healed, one thing I did do was I met with the stake president. And I said, if I ever decided to come back to the church, what would I have to do? And he said, you'd have to have a church court because you were excommunicated. And I said, I didn't do anything wrong. I will never have a church court. Okay? So, in 2015, 6 years later, when I had my testimony back, I went to the stake president's office, and it was the same stake president from 6 years earlier. And I said, I didn't think he'd remember me. So I just said, if I want to come back to church, what do I have to do? And he looked at me and he says, the same thing I told you 6 years ago. You're going to have a church court. And my answer was, whatever it takes. Okay? But I also said, but I was told I could never come back to the church because I'd committed the unforgivable sin. And he said, looked at me and he said, not true. You can. And we'll work toward that. So I had my church court.
Great, that's awesome. So can you describe to us what is the process? Like, if I was in the faith and I've left it, how do I get back in? What's the process?
So I show up to the stake president's office, and he's got a conference room, kind of, I guess. It's got a long table with all these chairs around it filled with people. But I sit in his office, and they have a meeting, I'm guessing about me. And then at one point, the stake president comes in. He says, okay, we're going to go in there. You're going to sit beside me. I'm going to be your advocate. And I said, okay. And he said, you nervous? And I said, no. It was going to be what it was going to be. You know, I had no control over it. But a funny thing happened in that hearing is after the stake president presents my case, explains the things that happened, explains why I was excommunicated, and he mentioned that they don't do that now. If you ask for your name to be removed from records, they just remove it. They don't necessarily excommunicate you anymore. I'm not saying they never do, but it's not automatic like it was in '89. And he made that point to them. One of the high priests said, how do we know that if you hear something negative again against the church, that you won't leave the church again? And I said, is there something new? Because I've been using the old stuff for 26 years. So if you have something new, tell me now. But trust me, the old stuff's not going to affect me. And he said, fair point. And I was asked to then go back to the stake president's office. And then the stake president came and got me and took me back in and said, we are going to approve and recommend you get baptized immediately.
Did that decision have to go through the first presidency or the church leaders in Salt Lake for approval?
I don't know.
Okay. Was there a rebaptism, like you have to go in the water again, or was it just like a letter?
Rebaptism.
Okay.
I got rebaptized, and a year later, I had my priesthood restored.
Okay, and that also was restored by a laying on of hands?
Yes, and that was that did have to come from the first presidency.
Okay.
And I was a gospel doctrine teacher at the time. But my priesthood was restored even before President Uchtdorf gave his talk.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And he actually, but after his talk, he actually confirmed me as a high priest.
President Uchtdorf did.
Mm-hmm. And that was the night he talked. See, before that, my wife, who was the one that initially got things rolling, my movement here, was Southern Baptist, and she said, look, I'll support you. I'll go to church with you. I'll go to functions with you. Never, ever, 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 ever going to get baptized. Well, when we went to President Uchtdorf's office, he chatted with her. And the next day she said, I'm ready for the discussions. And shortly thereafter, I was an incredible, and I think unique experience to baptized my own wife. And then a year later, we were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple.
So was your wife also a member and left when you did?
No.
Or had she never been a member?
Yeah, and look, one thing I say in the fireside, and this is absolutely true. I never pressured her to come to the church. The only thing I ever said was, "Hey, baby, my patriarchal blessing says I get sealed in the temple. I'd like it to be with you."
Pressure.
That's good. So your wife wasn't ever a member before then?
When I married her, I was still Catholic.
Okay.
And we got married we got remarried. Well, she and I had dated a long time ago and didn't for 15 years. We're not together. Then we got together 15 years later and got married in 2010. So we got married after I got healed in 2009, and before 2015 I get rebaptized. So she said, "Look, I might become Catholic. I will never become member. I might have become Catholic with you. I will never become member of the LDS Church." She was very adamant about that until she spoke with President Uchtdorf, and he just said, "Look, he said lots of cool stuff to her. He was just so understanding, and he's just so caring. But he said two things. Number one, to bring what you know, we'll add to it. And he said, I know that Dusty wants to be sealed to you in the temple. We'll save a place for you. He knew. He knew.
That's exciting. So tell me about your feelings coming out of the water again the second time.
The day that Suze couldn't be there, my wife couldn't be there because she was in Utah when I was rebaptized. Let me tell you a little story. When I was a member the first time, back in '83, I knew a guy that I was friends with from the University Ward named McKay Judd. And McKay and I were friends, and we lost touch when I left the church. That was in Austin, Texas. When I was going to get rebaptized, I was excited, right? So I began to look for my old friends that I had on Facebook to tell them that I was getting rebaptized. And I found McKay. And I told McKay that I messaged him and said, "You're not going to believe this. 26 years later, I come back to the church," and McKay said, "I'm a bishop in, I want to say Frisco, Texas. Maybe it was Allen, Texas, McKinney, Texas, someplace close to where I was, within 40-minute drive." He said, "I would love to be there, but we have a function. I can't be there, but my heart will be with you." The weekend I got rebaptized, a deluge in Dallas area rained his function out, and he came to my baptism. So it was very cool to have part of my past there. He actually ordained me, but my baptism was actually done by an attorney that I had gone up against many times, and he was a member of the church. And not only did we argue law, we argued the church. And he's the one that rebaptized me. And the feeling that I had was, I'm home. I'm back where I belong. I should have never left.
Okay, that's good. So can you perhaps contrast your feelings? A lot of people say they're happy when they leave the church. You're happy when you come back. Contrast those happinesses, those feelings, the peacefulness, the freedom, etc.
When I left the church, I felt a lot of hatred and a lot of anger, and I felt like I had been deceived, and I felt free. I'm free. I'm out.
You know, now I can live my life. When I got rebaptized, I felt an incredible amount of love. I felt I was back where I belonged. And I felt free because I was home. I'm not a visionary person, but when I got my testimony back, I had like a vision where the Lord walked up to me with his hands cupped. And he said, I've taken care of this testimony for 26 years. I'm going to give it back to you now. This time, take care of it. And he touched my chest, and I could feel it enter my heart. And it occurred to me for the first time, you know, back when I remember the first time, a testimony was like something that was in iCloud. You know, you pulled it down for testimony Sundays to bear your testimony, then put it back up there in the iCloud and used it when you needed it and brought it down and then put it back in the cloud. And when he came with his hands cupped, he was holding it in his hands. It was a real. It wasn't some thing. It was real. And it occurred to me, if you don't feed it, water it, exercise it, it will die. And it occurred to me that I killed my testimony before because I didn't do those things. I mean, like I was in law. I mean, I was in law school. I was working a full-time job, law school full-time, had a family, averaged 3 hours of sleep a night for 3.5 years. I wasn't prepared for that physical battle. I mean, that spiritual battle. I didn't take care of it like I should have. I don't plan to make that mistake again.
Speaking of keeping that testimony, I mean, you know that testimonies can be delicate. So what are you doing now? What are you doing this time to keep it bright, to keep that testimony firm within you?
I read the scriptures daily, for one thing. Literally daily, I read the scriptures. But I also pray more. But I don't necessarily always hit my knees. Sometimes I just say, I'll be walking and I'll see the sunrise and I'll say, wow, Heavenly Father, great job today with that art, that sunrise, beautiful. You know, I find myself just talking to him sometimes. But I also, before COVID, I had done over 80 firesides in 7 different states. Since COVID, I've done other firesides around the world using Zoom. I had a fireside last week in Logan, back to live firesides again. I have a couple of weeks, well, about a month ago, I had, in 1 week, a Zoom fireside in Scotland and a Zoom fireside in South Africa the same week. So I'm up to 96, I think, now, firesides. That's what I do. I find that helping people with their testimony helps me with my testimony. You know, the old thing, when you teach, both of you learn. You know, so yeah.
I know you do a lot of fireside chats, probably mostly with members of the church. But what do you tell people who are in your same position? Someone who is outside of the church, someone who has left the church. What kind of advice do you have for them?
In fact, that happened. I had a fella come up to a fireside because his wife wanted him to, but he was excommunicated member. And he told me, I don't have faith, can't have faith, will never have faith, don't have a testimony, will never have a testimony. And he asked me, he said, when I did my question and answer after my fireside, which I don't always do, but I did this night, he raised his hand first and he said, I can't prove faith exists. I'm an attorney like you. I can't prove it exists, so I can't have it. And I said, okay, do you love anybody? He said, my wife. I said, how do you prove it to her? He said, well, I'm nice to her. I said, so you love everybody you're nice to? And he said, well, no. And I said, okay, how about this? Does she love you? And he said, yeah. I said, do you ask her to prove it? And he said, no. And I said, well, then how do you know? And he says, I just believe she does. I said, that sounds like faith to me. And we chatted. And I said, you know, you got to get out of your way sometimes. You know, you make it too difficult. And he ended up coming back to the church. I was asked to speak at his rebaptism. He actually is a great-great-grandson of Brigham Young. But what I would, a lot of the people that talk to me or message me, email me, are people that are struggling with their testimony, or they're people that say, I have somebody struggling with the testimony. What do I tell them? And I say, first, be Mike. You know, don't fight. Mike, my friend Mike, after our initial rounds of debates, he stopped fighting with me. But he began praying for me and putting my name in the temple every week. I said, be Mike. If you have struggling with your testimony, I tell people, go back to the basics. Get away from the superfluous stuff. Get back to the basics. Did Joseph have that first vision? Yes. Did he translate the Book of Mormon? Yes. And I challenge people. Look, I say, look, I'm an attorney. I've published a book. I've published poetry. I've written songs. I've written legal briefs. I have tons of education. And I'm telling you right now, I could not write the Book of Mormon with all my experience and education, and yet detractors want you to believe that an uneducated kid wrote it. And I say, read the non-Isaiah parts of 2nd Nephi, that rich, incredibly rich doctrine of 2nd Nephi, and tell me that came from a man. Go back to the basics. And after that, what else matters? Seriously, nothing matters. He was a prophet. Now, does that mean that he was perfect? No. And I tell people, if you're looking for perfect, you're not going to find it. Look, Abraham lied, Moses killed, Peter denied. If you're looking for a perfect prophet, you're not going to find him now, and you're not going to find him in the Bible. Either testament. Only one perfect person existed in all of history, and it wasn't a prophet. So don't look for that. They're going to make mistakes. So you ignore the mistakes. Ignore them. Don't worry about them. If you don't like something, ignore that. Go back to the basics. Don't let your salvation be threatened by doubt. Don't let your doubts be stronger than your faith. Don't let the things you didn't know overcome the things that you do know. You know, and if you can go back to the basics, you'll be fine. Accept the basics. Read the Book of Mormon. And hold on to the basics. And humility. The difference between 2009, I will never have a church hearing, and 2015, whatever it takes, humility. When you're humble, it allows the Spirit to work in you. When you're not humble, when you have the ego fighting, when you have your pride fighting, it's a wall that the Spirit will not come across.
Dusty, if you had never humbled yourself, would you be back in the church today?
No. It wasn't until I humbled myself that the Lord was able to work in me and give me the answers that I needed to come back to the church.
Interesting. What advice would you have for members to help them deal with friends who are losing testimony, who are leaving the church, who have left the church? What can we do to help bring them back?
Well, I think humility runs both ways. You know, if a person's coming back to the church, members should accept them with open arms, because if they're coming back, it means the Lord's accepted the person back. And who are they to to question the Lord? As far as when people leave, I tell members all the time that ask, don't argue with them. Most antis know more than the members. They study it in order to fight it, to argue, to debate. That's how I was. I brought up facts, history of the church, facts that members didn't know. And they would have to go research themselves and find out that I was telling them the truth. Now, my take on it was different than their take after they'd read it, but my point is that if you argue, number one, the spirit goes away. But number two, you'll lose. In all likelihood, you'll lose, because most antis know more than most members. So don't argue. Love them, invite them. Don't get offended when they say no. Smile when they say no, and invite them again. Just be there, but don't be pushy. Love them back to the church. You're never going to get somebody back by fighting with them.
Okay, thank you. So, on the other hand, what advice might you have for those who are teetering, who are losing a hold on faith, and who are not sure how to go on?
Call me.
You get a lot of phone calls.
I do, and a lot of emails, and a lot of messages. Like I said, go back to the basics. You know, it's easy to find negative stuff about the church. You can find it anywhere. Anywhere. But that doesn't mean that the church is wrong, or the church is bad, or the church isn't true. It just means that the church has a history. It has warts. Of course it has warts. My gosh, it's been around, since 1830s. So it's going to have warts. It's going to have people that made mistakes, people that still make mistakes. You got to go back to the basics of where we come from and stick with that, and not let the actions of people affect and be stronger than the actions of God. Don't let people take away what God has given you. Don't let people hurt what God has gifted you.
So, what can members do then to help those who are teetering or who have left the faith? How can we clear the way for them to come back?
Yeah, be patient. But don't forget about them. We have a tendency to say, we have a tendency to, as we used to say in the mission field, wipe the dust off our feet, and give up on members that are belligerent or angry or argumentative or rude. Not thinking about where that comes from in those members. It comes from the feeling of being let down, being hurt, being offended, being losing a testimony. Whatever it is, that anger comes from a place of hurt, a place of anger, a place of so when you forget about them, it justifies their thoughts. It justifies, see, I told you. It's not true. I told you, I'm no good. Whatever it is. So love them. Don't forget them. Don't push them, but don't forget them. Let them know that they're always welcome. A lot of what people feel is against themselves. It's not against. When I met with President Uchtdorf the first time, he asked me, he said, "Do you have a testimony of the atonement?" And I said, "That's a trick question." And he said, "Why is that a trick question?" I said, "Because I believe in it for you. And I believe in it for everybody else. I don't believe in it for me." And he said, "Why?" And I lowered my eyes like this, and I was looking down at the floor, and I said, "Because for 26 years I did everything I could to hurt the church. Everything I could think of. I don't deserve the atonement. And I was looking at the floor and he said, Dusty. And I looked up and he had that smile on his face that you see in conference, you know, when he's talking, he has that kind of half smile. And he said, your sins are forgiven. A lot of my feelings was hate for myself. And I think there's a lot of members that feel that. I think a lot of members feel that they're not worthy anymore, that they're not, you know, so love them. Invite them to a sacrament meeting. Invite them to a fun function. If they say no, don't get offended. Don't give up. Mike put my name in the temple every week for 20 years. What kind of love is that? And I would tell him, don't do that. I don't want my name in your temples. I don't want false church, false God, false temples. No, no, no. He never gave up. He never quit. And look, because of Mike, I came back to the church. Well, not necessarily true. I came back to the church because of the Spirit. But Mike had a huge hand in that because he never gave up. He never gave up. And because of that, think of the people that have been touched by the story. Look, I did a video that's had 1.1 million views. I had a magazine article that had 600,000 views. I had another YouTube thing that had 60,000 views. I've had 90-something firesides, a book, podcasts. How many people have been touched with the story that God loves them because of the things that attributed in some part to things that Mike did by Mike not giving up? So you just never know. You just never know. If you continue loving them, you never know what's going to happen in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. You don't. So don't give up. Don't get angry. Don't get offended. Love them.
As I've talked with others who have left the church, one of the biggest obstacles, concerns that they have is that they say their friends left them. Their friends won't talk to them anymore. They don't come over.
Yep. That happened to me. When I left the church, people that were my friends stopped talking to me. I couldn't win. When I became a member, my friends left me that I had when I left. Those friends left me. Maybe it's just me. But it's amazing. It's amazing. But I look at Mike, who never gave up for 20 years. And I look at Steve Marsh, who was the attorney I talked about that was part of my rebaptism. He and I were, like I said, opponents in the courtroom. And we would have these long conversations about the church. And I would tell him why I didn't like the church, but he never gave up on me. So you never know, you just never know what you can accomplish. I can tell you this, if you're not loving and you're not patient and loyal, then you will never be a factor in that person coming back to the church. But if you are, you never know. Heavens, Mike could have given up any time in 20 years, but he didn't. That's just amazing to me.
Yeah, but sometimes members feel that if they stay in communication, if they stay friends, they'll be pulled down or they'll be pulled away from the church, and they love the church. They don't want that to happen.
Well, but yeah, and that's a danger if you do it wrong. But like I said, don't argue with them. Don't discuss the church with them. If somebody asks a question because they want to know the answer, you know, as opposed to somebody who asks the question because they want to debate with you. Okay? Don't debate, because that will drag you down. It will. It'll start, if nothing else, it'll start causing you to have doubt, because they're going to make points and you're going, I never considered that. Okay, but don't argue with them. Don't be pulled down into that argument. So you can be friends with somebody and not debate them. Mike stopped debating me. Okay? He just stopped debating me. I couldn't get him to debate me. But he never stopped praying for me, never stopped talking to me. We talked on the phone all the time. He came to Dallas a couple of times. Once he had me drive he and his wife to the Dallas temple and wait for him in the parking lot. So I was on temple grounds. You don't think I felt a little pull? You know? Mike was clever, but he was also very persistent. But he stopped debating with me. And if you don't debate with them, if you just love them, you know, if they ask a serious question with serious intent, humble intent, you know. But you also know when someone's baiting you. Don't be baited.
Okay. Thank you, Dusty. I so appreciate your time here today. This has been most beneficial to me, and I hope it will be to others. Would you mind, as we end here, would you bear your testimony, share that with those who are watching?
I was in a play called The Company of Wayward Saints, and it was about a group of improvisationists who went around and would take from the audience hints on what they wanted to see acted out. And in one scene, I play an old-fashioned doctor who does house calls, and I'm visiting with a prospective. I'm at a house to deliver a baby, and I'm with the prospective father on the front porch of the house. And at some point, the prospective father says, "Shouldn't you be doing something?" And my answer in the play is, when God's ready, he'll let us know. And his question in the play is, you believe in God? And my answer in the play is, that's a difficult question for a man of science to answer. But I will tell you this, I know that God believes in me. And I end every fireside by saying, that's my testimony, that no matter what you do, the Lord loves you. Nothing you can do can take you out of the reach of Heavenly Father's arms. Nothing you can say will make him stop loving you. Nothing you can think will make him stop loving you. And nothing you ever think, say, or do will make him stop believing in you. And it's comforting to me to know that no matter what I do in my life, Heavenly Father, even though he knows I sin, he knows I'm not perfect, he always believes in me. And the scriptures say, if he's for you, who can be against you? And I leave this testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Dusty. I appreciate you being here today.